Millions of people have sung those words. Imagine there's no heaven. They have sung them at candlelight vigils and championship celebrations, in football stadiums and quiet kitchens at 2 in the morning when sleep would not come. They have sung them in languages John Lennon never spoke, in countries he never visited, in moments of history he never lived to see. The song became so universal that most people stopped asking where it came from. They assumed it had always existed, like rain, like something the universe had simply always carried. But it had not always existed. It came from one man, sitting at a white piano, inside a house that felt more like a gilded cage than a home, during a period when he was genuinely uncertain whether he had anything left worth saying. Because the version of John Lennon the world believed in and the version sitting at that piano in 1971 were not entirely the same person. John Winston Lennon was born on October 9th, 1940, in Liverpool, England, during a German air raid. His aunt Mimi later said he arrived in the world with noise and chaos already surrounding him, as though the universe had designed the entrance specifically. His father Alfred was absent for most of his early years. His mother Julia loved him but was unable to care for him consistently, and so John was raised by Mimi in a modest house on Menlove Avenue in Woolton, a house full of books, structure, and a particular English propriety that young John both absorbed and quietly resisted with every breath he took. He was a difficult child, not destructive but restless in a way that exhausted those around him. His mind moved faster than his surroundings could accommodate, sharp-tongued in class, funny in ways that made teachers uncomfortable. He drew obsessively, filling notebooks with cartoons and wordplay. He was, in the language of 1950s British education, a problem. In any other language, he was simply someone whose imagination exceeded the container the world had built for him. Then rock and roll arrived in England, and John Lennon found the first container that actually fit. When he first heard Elvis Presley coming through a radio speaker in the mid-1950s, something shifted inside John that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. The realization that a human voice could carry something raw and unmediated, bypassing all the filters the adult world had constructed between feeling and expression. He begged Mimi for a guitar. She told him it was all right for a hobby. He took the guitar anyway. He formed the Quarrymen in 1956, and it was at one of those early performances that a 15-year-old named Paul McCartney introduced himself afterward. The two recognized something in each other almost immediately. Not friendship exactly, but a creative voltage that each had been carrying alone and suddenly found could be doubled. What followed is the most documented story in the history of popular music: the Hamburg Residencies, the Cavern Club, Brian Epstein, EMI, Beatlemania in 1963. John Lennon went from Liverpool basements to global phenomenon in what felt, from the outside, like the space of a single breath. But from the inside, it had been years of grinding work, years of developing a vocabulary unlike anything the world had yet encountered. The overnight success was not overnight at all, and the real story was never only in the music. By 1964, John Lennon was one of the most famous human beings on the planet. The Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show to an estimated American audience of 73 million people. Cities shut down when they arrived. The world was watching him in a way that no amount of creative preparation can ready a human being for. And John responded with the only tools he had ever known: words and music. The early records were joyful and immediate. But even within them, something more complex was reaching toward the surface. The searching quality in My Life reads less like a pop lyric and more like a young man genuinely attempting to make sense of what his life had meant before fame consumed it entirely. The transformation deepened as the decade advanced. Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper. He was reading eclectically, Eastern philosophy, Lewis Carroll, and questioning, with a relentlessness that could not be quieted, the nature of the world he inhabited. The applause was real, the stadiums were real, but what John was searching for could not be delivered through any of that. That was where the distance began, and it was growing. The dissolution of the Beatles was not a single event. It was a long, painful public unraveling played out over years, with legal battles amplified by the fact that everything about these four men had been conducted in front of the entire world. For John, the end carried multiple losses simultaneously: the professional, the personal, and the confrontation with who he actually was without the Beatles to define him. He was 30 years old, one of the most famous people alive, married to Yoko Ono, whose influence on his artistic development was profound and genuine, and he was, by his own account, genuinely lost. He had achieved everything the world recognized as success, and none of it had answered the questions he had always been asking. He released John Lennon slash Plastic Ono Band in late 1970, one of the most nakedly confessional records ever made by a major artist. Songs about his mother Julia, killed when he was 17, songs about the God-shaped hole at the center of his experience. It was John stripping away every layer of persona and performance, showing what was underneath. What was underneath was a man who had been searching his entire life and had not yet found what he was looking for. But something else was also forming during this period. Something quieter, something that would eventually become the most recognized song of the 20th century, though in 1970 it was not yet even a complete thought. He had said what he needed to say about what hurt. Now he was beginning to move toward what he believed, and what he believed, it turned out, was harder to write than anything he had ever attempted, because writing about pain is one thing, writing about hope, real hope, the kind that has looked at darkness directly and chosen something else, is entirely different, and John was not yet sure he was capable of it. Tittenhurst Park was a 72-acre estate in Ascot, Berkshire, that John and Yoko had purchased in 1969, with a recording studio built into the grounds, Ascot Sound Studios, because John needed to work at any hour without booking time elsewhere. In the main house, in a white-painted room that opened onto the grounds through large windows, stood a white Steinway grand piano. He had had it specially painted. The whiteness was not accidental. He had always been drawn to extreme visual simplicity when trying to do complex emotional work, as though reducing the visual noise gave the internal noise more room to move. He spent hours at that piano during the early months of 1971, sometimes playing things he had played before, sometimes drifting into new territories, sometimes simply sitting while the English countryside went about its patient business outside the glass. Yoko was often nearby working on her own art, and between them a creative atmosphere that visitors consistently described as unlike anything they had encountered elsewhere. The song that became Imagine did not arrive all at once. John had been reading Grapefruit, a book of art instructions Yoko had written in 1964, and he later acknowledged that the conceptual seeds of Imagine were planted in her work, in her insistence on the power of collective visualization. He had also been carrying for years an image from his childhood, a world without the divisions that caused the suffering he had witnessed, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, the ongoing violence that seemed to be what civilization produced when it turned its full attention to the project of destroying itself. But something was blocking the song, and the block was not technical. John Lennon had never been blocked technically. The block was fear. The fear that what he wanted to say was too simple, that the song forming in his mind with its undefended hopefulness would be dismissed as naive, that a man celebrated for his intelligence and edge would be seen as having run out of ideas if he simply stood up and asked the world to try to be better. The simplicity felt like exposure, and John Lennon, despite every performance of confidence, was afraid of being exposed as what he had actually always been, a man who genuinely believed in the possibility of something better and was terrified that believing was not enough. That fear, it turned out, was precisely what the song needed, because the most powerful things are rarely written by people who have nothing to lose. Those present at Tittenhurst in early spring 1971 describe a particular quality to the atmosphere, not dramatic, not charged with the obvious electricity of breakthrough, more like the feeling of something large moving very slowly toward completion. John was quieter than usual. He was at the piano for longer stretches, the playing often fragmentary, returning to the same intervals with the patience of someone working a combination lock from the inside. Then one morning, the combination opened. The melody was simple, the kind of simple that looks easy and is not. The harmonic movement in the verse creates exactly the emotional space the lyric needed. Room to breathe, room for the listener to step inside the words rather than simply reading them from outside. But the lyrics were what stopped people. What John had written was not a protest song, not a love song, not a political statement exactly, though it carried all three. What it was an invitation, a patient, serious, unironic invitation to collective imagination as a form of moral action. The word imagine was doing all the work that argue or demand had never quite managed. It was not telling people what to think, it was asking them to think it themselves. And that distinction, simple as it sounds, was the difference between a pamphlet and a prayer. John recorded a rough version at the white piano that same morning, just his voice and the Steinway. Even in that unpolished form, the song had the quality that every truly important piece of music has. It sounded like something that had always existed and had simply been waiting to be found. Yoko heard it and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said simply that it was the one. John nodded. He had known it from the moment the words came together. That was exactly what had frightened him so much in the weeks before it arrived. Knowing that something is the most important thing you have ever made does not make it easier to release into the world. It makes it harder. The full Imagine album was recorded at Ascot Sound Studios in May and June of 1971 with producer Phil Spector and musicians including Klaus Voormann and Alan White. The sessions were relatively smooth. John had a clear vision, more melodic and open than the Plastic Ono band, but retaining its emotional honesty. The full production version, with its string arrangement and the orchestral texture Spector brought, added warmth and scale without losing the intimacy at its center. But John was not at peace. He had already been a target of the Nixon administration's immigration proceedings. Releasing a record that opened with a call to imagine a world without nations and without hierarchies of wealth was not a neutral act in 1971. It was a statement of intent, and statements of intent have consequences. He was also wrestling with sincerity. He knew he was a man of enormous wealth singing about imagining no possessions, that the white estate and the white piano represented a material reality in complicated relationship with the song's vision. He addressed this later. The song is not about having already achieved what it imagines, it is about the direction of travel. But in the studio, in the quiet moments between takes, the contradiction was not easy to carry. There was one specific moment during the recording when John stopped between takes and sat at the piano without playing, just sat in the silence that musicians recognize as something internal being confronted. Perhaps 3 minutes passed. Then he straightened, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the engineer behind the glass. "Let's do another one," he said. The take after that silence was the one that ended up on the record. Whatever he worked through in those 3 minutes was in the vocal, the slightly raw quality, the sense that the words are being genuinely offered rather than performed. It always came from somewhere real. That was what made it matter. Imagine was released as a single in October 1971 in the United States, reaching number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, with the album entering charts on both sides of the Atlantic with immediate success. The critical response was largely positive, though voices on the political right identified its pacifist sentiments as subversive, and voices on the left found it insufficiently radical. John's response was consistent. The song was not a manifesto, it was an act of imagination. And acts of imagination were precisely what the world was most desperately short of. What happened with the song over the decades was something even John could not have fully anticipated. Imagine did not simply become a popular song. It became a secular hymn, a piece of music people reached for in the moments when they most needed to believe things could be different. Sung after disasters, performed at the 2006 Olympic Games, at memorials following the September 11th attacks, at countless moments of collective grief and hope when words in their usual form were insufficient. The song traveled into spaces no pop record had ever been asked to enter, and moved through all of them without losing what it had been when John played it alone at the white piano on that quiet morning in Ascot. This is not an accident of cultural programming. What Imagine carries is the combination of its directness and its generosity. It does not tell the listener what to be. It invites the listener to imagine being it. The serious and entirely unironic asking of a man who had seen enough darkness to have given up on hope but chose not to carries a moral weight the listener feels even without being able to explain it. But the man who wrote those words was living with something the words themselves could not resolve, and that is the part of the story that changes everything. The years between Imagine in 1971 and Double Fantasy in 1980 were years of considerable complexity, a period of separation from Yoko lasting approximately 18 months, during which John was in Los Angeles, by his own later account not at his best. He was a man who had written about peace and was not at peace. He had asked the world to imagine the brotherhood of all people, and was having tremendous difficulty maintaining his own relationships. This is not a contradiction that diminishes the song. The gap between what we can envision and what we can achieve is not evidence that the vision is false. It is evidence that we are human. John knew this. He was not a saint and never claimed to be. He was a man who had glimpsed something true, tried to put it into music, and then had to live in the distance between the glimpse and the arrival. And it may have made the music more meaningful, not less. When John returned to Yoko in early 1975 and withdrew from public life for 5 years to raise his son Sean, he was doing something the era had no category for. A major rock star simply stopping, genuinely present, making lunches, watching Sean learn to walk. During those 5 years, Imagine continued its work in the world without him. The song was living its own life, reaching into moments its creator was not present to witness. And then in 1980, he came back. Double Fantasy was released on November 17th, 1980. The first new material John had released in 5 years, received with genuine warmth. The album was lighter in tone, domestic in its concerns, songs about being a father, about being in love, about the pleasure of ordinary days. It was John Lennon in a key some found unfamiliar, stripped of grand political vision. The willingness to celebrate small things is not a lesser ambition. For someone who had spent years in the theater of large ones, it may be the harder one. He was giving interviews in December, talking about the future, about more music. Those who spoke with him during those final weeks described him as more settled than he had been in years, something steadier, something that suggested he had arrived somewhere, or was at least closer to arriving than he had ever been before. What happened on the evening of December 8th, 1980, outside the Dakota Building in New York belongs in the historical record with its full and terrible weight. What it took from the world was immeasurable. The grief that followed confirmed something John had always believed, that music creates bonds between people who have never met, that a voice sent into the world becomes part of the inner lives of people the singer never knew. The grief was not for a celebrity. It was for someone whose absence left a specific silence the world had not known it would be unable to fill. And yet the song remained. The song has always remained. There is a particular quality to great music that is difficult to name but instantly recognizable, simultaneously specific and universal, speaking from one human experience in a voice that everyone can hear themselves inside. In Imagine, John Lennon achieved something belonging to a very small number of human creations. The quality of arriving exactly when the world needed it, and then staying, refusing to be contained by the moment of its creation. The white piano from Tittenhurst eventually made its way to exhibitions around the world, where people gather to stand before it with a reverence the object itself does not quite explain. What they are standing before is not the piano. They are standing before the morning, the specific morning in 1971 when a man sat at that instrument with everything he had lived through and everything he had not yet resolved, and chose to reach past all of it towards something he could only imagine, and chose to ask the rest of us to imagine it with him. That choice, hope over despair, invitation over demand, was not easy. It was made by someone who had every reason to have made a different choice. It was made in full knowledge of the contradiction between the vision and the life of the person holding it. It required the kind of courage that does not feel like courage from the inside, the kind that feels like necessity, like the only thing left when all the alternatives have been tried. John Lennon sat at a white piano in 1971 and wrote the most widely shared wish in the history of popular music, not because he had achieved what the wish described, because he had not, because he was still traveling toward it, because we all still are, and that is why the song endures. Not because it promises arrival, because it names the journey, because it says, without sentimentality, that the journey is worth taking, that imagining itself is a form of action, that to hold a vision of what the world could be is to participate in making it so, however slowly, however imperfectly. The white piano is still, the room in Ascot is quiet, but somewhere in the world at this very moment someone is hearing Imagine for the first time, in a language John Lennon never spoke, in a year he never reached. And they are being asked, gently and seriously, to consider the possibility that the world does not have to be exactly what it is, that we have the capacity to dream of something larger, and that the dreaming, patient and imperfect and entirely human, is already a beginning. That is the legacy of John Lennon. Not the fame, not the records, not the image on the posters and murals that have outlived him by more than 4 decades. The legacy is the permission he gave, in 3 minutes and 7 seconds of melody and lyric and the sound of a white piano on an English morning, to believe that imagination is not an escape from the world. It is the way we change it. He knew that since he was a boy in Liverpool who heard a voice on the radio and understood that sound could carry truth, he carried that understanding through everything the world gave him and everything it took away, and he set it down, finally, in the simplest and most lasting form he could find: a word, a question, an invitation that has not expired. Imagine